I was standing in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning when I saw three men with shovels and lumber walking across my woodland like they owned the place. They were heading straight for the oak grove at the back of my property, a section I had deliberately left wild and untouched since buying the house in rural Vermont 5 years ago. My coffee mug stopped halfway to my mouth as I watched them start digging holes in my ground without so much as a knock on my door. I set down the mug and headed outside, pulling on my work boots as I went. The March air was still cold enough to see my breath, and patches of snow clung to the shaded areas under the trees. As I got closer, I could see they were setting posts in concrete, clearly building something permanent. "Hey," I called out, my voice carrying across the 50 yards between us. "What are you doing on my property?" One of the men, a younger guy in a reflective vest, looked up and waved casually like we were old friends. "Morning. Just following the work order from the HOA, building communal firewood racks. Communal firewood racks, on my land." I walked faster now, anger building in my chest. I didn't authorize any of this. The older man, who seemed to be in charge, pulled out a folded paper from his pocket. "Says here it's common area. The HOA approved it last month. We're just doing our job, buddy. This is not common area. This is my private woodland. You need to leave. Now." The third worker, a heavy-set man with a gray beard, didn't even look up from mixing concrete. "Take it up with the HOA. We got paid to do a job, and that's what we're doing." I stood there for a moment, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. This was exactly the kind of overreach I had feared when I first moved into this neighborhood. The HOA had seemed reasonable enough at first, but over the past year, they had become increasingly aggressive about enforcing rules and expanding their authority. I had attended exactly one meeting, and that had been enough to show me the circus I was dealing with. "Stop working right now, or I'm calling the police," I said firmly. The older man sighed and put his hands on his hips. "Listen, mister. I don't know what your beef is, but we're not stopping until the job's done. Like I said, take it up with the HOA." I pulled out my phone and called the non-emergency police line. While I waited for someone to answer, the workers continued their job, completely unbothered. When the dispatcher picked up, I explained the situation as calmly as I could manage. "We can send someone out to check on it," the dispatcher said. "But if they have a work order and there's a dispute about property lines, this sounds like a civil matter. You might need to contact a lawyer. They're trespassing and building structures on my land without permission. That's not a civil matter. An officer will be out within the hour, sir." I hung up and watched the workers continue to dig and set posts. 4 posts were already in place, forming the corners of what would apparently be a large firewood storage rack. The anger in my chest was now a full boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. Losing my temper wouldn't help anything. "I've called the police," I told them. "They're on their way." "Good for you," the bearded man said without looking up. I went back to my house, grabbed my property deed and survey documents, and returned to wait. The workers had moved on to cutting lumber for the horizontal supports. They worked efficiently, clearly experienced in what they were doing. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy pulled up in front of my house, and I waved him over. Deputy Morgan was a middle-aged man with a tired expression that suggested he had dealt with too many property disputes in his career. I showed him my documents and explained that these men were building on my private property without permission. The supervisor showed him the HOA work order. It listed the location as common area behind lots 4752 and included what appeared to be an official HOA stamp and signature. "This is lot 49, I said, pointing to my survey. "And everything behind my house up to the tree line at the back is my property. There is no common area here." Deputy Morgan studied both documents. Looks like there's a genuine disagreement here. The HOA seems to think this is common area, but your deed clearly shows it as private property. This really is a civil matter. You need to contact the HOA directly and probably get a lawyer involved. So they can just keep building while I sort this out. I can ask them to stop work until it's resolved, he said, then turned to the workers. Guys, you need to hold off on this project until the property ownership is clarified. The supervisor shrugged. Fine by me. We get paid either way. But you need to tell the HOA, because they're going to call us tomorrow and ask why we're not done. After the deputy left and the workers packed up their tools, I stood in my woodland looking at the 4 posts they had already set in concrete. They were solid, professional work, sunk deep and level. Getting them out would be a pain, but that was a problem for later. First, I needed to deal with the HOA. I drove to the address listed on the HOA work order, a small office in a strip mall about 15 minutes away. The sign on the door read Pinewood Heights HOA Management in gold lettering. Inside, a young receptionist sat behind a desk, typing on a computer. I need to speak with whoever approved this work order, I said, sliding the paper across her desk. She glanced at it and then at me. That would be Brenda Carmichael, our HOA president. Do you have an appointment? No, but this is urgent. Your contractors were building on my private property this morning. Let me see if she's available. The receptionist picked up her phone and spoke quietly into it. After a moment, she hung up and gestured to a hallway. Second door on the left. Brenda Carmichael was exactly what I expected. She sat behind a large desk in a small office. A woman in her late 40s with blonde highlights and an expression that suggested she was already annoyed before I walked in. Her desk was meticulously organized, with color-coded folders and a nameplate that looked like it cost more than my monthly grocery bill. You must be Xavier Marks from Lot 49, she said without standing or offering to shake hands. I heard you caused quite a scene this morning. I stopped contractors from illegally building on my property. If that's causing a scene, then yes. That woodland area is designated common space according to our community development plan. We're building firewood racks there for the benefit of all residents. I pulled out my property deed and survey. This is my deed. This is my survey. Both clearly show that woodland as part of my lot. There is no common space behind my house. Brenda barely glanced at the documents. Those are outdated. When you purchased your property, you agreed to the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Those CCRs include provisions for common areas that benefit the community. Show me where in the CCRs it says you can claim private property as common space. The CCRs give the HOA board authority to designate and maintain common areas for the benefit of all residents. We voted on this project 3 months ago. If you had attended the meetings, you would have known about it. You can't vote to take someone's private property. That's not how property rights work. Brenda's expression hardened. Mr. Marks, you're being very difficult about something that benefits everyone. Several residents complained that they had nowhere to store firewood for their stoves and fireplaces. The board decided the woodland behind your property was the perfect location for communal storage. It's barely used anyway. It's barely used because it's my private property and I choose to keep it natural. You don't get to decide what I do with my land. As a member of this HOA, you don't have absolute control over your property. There are rules and guidelines you agreed to follow. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. I'm going to say this very clearly. That woodland is my private property. You do not have permission to build anything on it. If those workers return, I will have them arrested for trespassing. If the structures remain, I will have them removed and bill the HOA for my costs." Brenda stood up, her face flushed. "You can't threaten this HOA. We have legal authority over this community. If you interfere with this project, we'll fine you. We can also place a lien on your property for non-compliance." "Fine me for what?" "Defending my property rights. For violating the CCRs and obstructing an approved community improvement project. The fine schedule allows for up to $500 per day for willful violations." I left the office before I said something I would regret. On the drive home, I called my lawyer, a real estate attorney named Thomas Reeves I had used when buying the house. His secretary said he could see me the next morning. When I got back home, I walked out to the Woodland and examined the 4 posts. They were set in concrete that had already hardened in the cold air. I tried to wobble one, but it was solid. These weren't coming out without serious effort. That evening, I searched through all my closing documents, reading every page of the HOA CCRs carefully. Nowhere did it give the HOA authority to claim private property as common space. There were provisions about architectural control, landscaping requirements, and maintenance standards, but nothing that even hinted at what Brenda was claiming. The next morning, I met with Thomas Reeves in his office in downtown Burlington. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s who had practiced real estate law in Vermont for over 30 years. I spread out all my documents on his conference table and explained everything that had happened. Thomas studied the papers carefully, paying particular attention to the survey and the HOA CCRs. "This is pretty clear-cut. Your property boundaries include the Woodland. The HOA has no authority under these CCRs to claim it as common space. What they're doing is called adverse possession, except they're trying to do it overnight instead of over the 20 years Vermont law requires. So, what do? We send them a cease and desist letter immediately. We also notify them that they need to remove the structures they've already built within 7 days, or you'll remove them yourself and charge them for your time and materials. If they don't comply, we file for a temporary restraining order and sue for trespass." "How long will all that take?" "The letter goes out today. They have 7 days to respond. If they don't comply, we can usually get a TRO hearing within a week or 2. The lawsuit itself could take months or even a year, but the TRO should stop any construction in the meantime. And if they keep fining me like they threatened, any fines based on this situation would be invalid. If they try to place a lien on your property, we'll fight that too. Don't worry, Mr. Marks. You have the law on your side here." I left Thomas's office feeling slightly better. At least I was taking action instead of just stewing in anger. The letter went out that afternoon via certified mail and email. For the next few days, nothing happened. The wooden post stood in my woodland like a taunt, but no workers returned. Then, 6 days after the letter was sent, I received a thick envelope in my mail. Inside was a notice of fine from the Pinewood Heights HOA. According to the letter, I was being fined $500 per day, starting from the date I had stopped the workers, for obstructing an approved community improvement project and violating HOA bylaws regarding community cooperation. The total fine was already $3,000 and climbing daily. I forwarded the letter to Thomas, who called me within an hour. "This is retaliation, plain and simple. It actually helps our case. They're proving that they're acting in bad faith." That doesn't make me feel better about being fined $3,000. Don't pay it, not a cent. We're filing for the TRO tomorrow. I'll have papers ready by end of business today. 2 days later, on a Thursday morning, the workers returned. I was in my home office when I heard trucks pulling up. Looking out the window, I saw the same 3 men unloading lumber and tools. They walked right past my property line signs and headed for the 4 posts. I called Thomas immediately. They're back. They're continuing construction. Did you tell them to leave? I'm walking out there now. Don't do anything physical. Just tell them they're trespassing and that legal action is in progress. I'll contact the sheriff's office. I walked out to the Woodland, my phone recording video as I went. The workers had already started attaching horizontal supports between the posts. You need to leave my property, I said loudly and clearly for the camera. You're trespassing. There is active litigation about this issue. The supervisor looked annoyed. We got another call from the HOA saying we had permission and needed to finish the job. You don't have permission. This is my private property. I'm telling you directly to leave. If you don't, you're trespassing and I'm calling the police again. Look, buddy, we're just trying to make a living. Then stop taking jobs building on other people's property without proper authorization. Leave now. The 3 men looked at each other. The bearded one shrugged. This is getting ridiculous. I don't care how much they're paying us. Let's pack it up. What? Come on, man. We need this job, the young one protested. Not worth getting arrested over. This guy's serious and I don't blame him. The HOA lady sounded crazy on the phone anyway. They packed up their tools and left. I saved the video and sent it to Thomas, along with a photo of the partially built rack. That afternoon, I received an email from Brenda Carmichael. The subject line was "Final Warning" in all caps. The email informed me that my fines had now reached $4,000 and would continue until I stopped interfering with the project. It also stated that the HOA board had voted to place a lien on my property if the fines weren't paid within 30 days. Thomas filed the motion for a temporary restraining order that evening. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Over the weekend, I spent time researching Pinewood Heights HOA and Brenda Carmichael. What I found was enlightening. There were dozens of complaints on neighborhood forums about the HOA's aggressive tactics. Multiple residents had been fined for minor violations like having the wrong shade of mailbox or parking in their own driveway after 8 p.m. 3 different homeowners had sold their houses specifically to get away from the HOA, according to posts I found. Brenda herself had been HOA president for 7 years. She had run unopposed for the last 3 elections because anyone who tried to run against her was suddenly hit with multiple fines and violations until they withdrew. The HOA board consisted of her and 2 other people who seemed to vote yes on everything she proposed. On Monday morning, I was working in my home office when I heard a chainsaw. My stomach dropped. I looked out the window and saw 2 different men in the Woodland, and they weren't just building the rack. They were cutting down trees. I ran outside. "What the hell are you doing?" One of the men, wearing safety goggles and work gloves, shut off his chainsaw. "Clearing the area. The HOA wants room for 3 firewood racks, not just 1. We need to take down these smaller trees to make space. You're cutting down trees on my property without permission. That's destruction of property. Stop right now. We have a work order from the HOA. I don't care if you have a work order from the governor. This is my land. Those are my trees. Stop cutting them down." The second man, who had been dragging cut branches into a pile, shook his head. "You really need to sort out your issues with the HOA, man. We keep getting sent out here and you keep yelling at us. It's getting old. Then stop trespassing on my property. The HOA says it's not your property. The HOA is wrong. There's a court hearing tomorrow about exactly this issue. If you cut down 1 more tree, I'm calling the police and my lawyer, and you'll both be named in the lawsuit." That got their attention. They looked at each other, and I could see the calculation happening. Whatever the HOA was paying them wasn't worth being sued personally. "Let's call Brenda and see what she says," one of them suggested. They made the call on speakerphone. When Brenda answered, her voice was sharp. "This better be important. I'm in a meeting. Mrs. Carmichael, this is John from Premium Tree Service. We're at the job site and the property owner is here. He's saying there's a lawsuit and will be named in it if we keep working. That man is lying and trying to intimidate you. Keep working. The HOA will cover any legal issues." "With all due respect, madam, we need written indemnification if there's an active lawsuit. Our insurance won't cover us otherwise." There was a long pause. "Fine. I'll have our lawyer draft something and email it to you within an hour. In the meantime, wait there and make sure he doesn't damage the work we've already done." The call ended. The two men looked at me, looked at the partially built rack and the 3 trees they had already cut down, and apparently decided waiting around wasn't worth it. "We'll come back when the legal stuff is sorted," one of them said, and they loaded their equipment and left. I took photos and videos of everything. 3 young birch trees lay on the ground, their white bark stark against the brown earth. The trees had been healthy and beautiful, part of the natural landscape I had specifically wanted to preserve. Seeing them cut down made me angrier than anything else so far. I sent everything to Thomas with a message. "They're now destroying trees. This is getting out of hand." He called me back immediately. "This is actually good for us, as terrible as that sounds. They're clearly acting maliciously now. The tree destruction can be added to the TRO and the lawsuit. In Vermont, you can sue for triple damages for timber trespass." What does that mean in real numbers? Those birch trees, if they were mature and healthy, could be worth several $100s each for damages. Triple that, we're talking potentially several $1,000s. Plus, we can argue this shows a pattern of willful destruction and disregard for your property rights. The court hearing the next day was in Vermont Superior Court in Burlington. I arrived early with Thomas and sat in the courtroom waiting for our case to be called. Brenda showed up with a lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone. When our case was called, Judge Patricia Henderson reviewed our motion quickly. She was a stern woman in her early 60s with reading glasses perched on her nose. "Mr. Reeves, you're asking for a temporary restraining order preventing the Pinewood Heights HOA from building on or otherwise using property at Lot 49. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. We have clear documentation that this property belongs to my client, Xavier Marks. The HOA has repeatedly trespassed, built structures, and most recently destroyed trees, all without permission and in direct violation of property law." The HOA's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, Stephen Rodriguez for the HOA. The property in question is designated as common area under the Community Development Plan. The HOA has authority to maintain and improve common areas for the benefit of residents." Judge Henderson looked at him over her glasses. "You have documentation showing this property is common area." "We have the HOA's Community Development Plan, which designates certain woodland areas as common space. I have Mr. Marks's property deed and survey right here. They clearly show the woodland as part of his private property. Do you have any deed or official document that contradicts this?" Rodriguez shuffled through his papers. "The HOA's plan has been in effect since the community was established." "That's not what I asked. Do you have a deed or survey showing this as common property?" "No, Your Honor, but the HOA has maintained this position consistently." "Being consistently wrong doesn't make you right, Counselor. I'm granting the temporary restraining order. The HOA and any contractors or agents working on their behalf are prohibited from entering the disputed property or conducting any work there until this matter is fully litigated. Mr. Rodriguez, I strongly suggest your clients review the actual property records before this goes any further. This seems like a fairly clear-cut case of trespass to me. Your Honor, I'd like to request that the property owner be prohibited from interfering with the structures already built. The structures that were built without permission on his private property. Denied. Mr. Marks, you have the right to remove any structures built on your property without your permission. However, I'd suggest documenting everything thoroughly before you do so. Next case. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt victorious for the first time since this whole mess started. Thomas was grinning. That went as well as we could have hoped. Judge Henderson saw right through their nonsense. Now, regarding the structures and trees, here's what I recommend. Document everything with photos and video. Get written quotes for the cost of removing the posts and repairing the land. Get an arborist to assess the value of the destroyed trees. Then, and only then, remove the structures if you want to. Save everything. The wood, the posts, the concrete, all of it. It's all evidence for the lawsuit. How long until we actually get to trial? Could be 6 months, could be a year. But with the TRO in place, they can't do anything else to your property in the meantime. We'll also file a motion for them to pay your legal fees since this is such a clear case of bad faith. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in 2 weeks. When I got there, I walked out to the Woodland and examined the partial structure. It consisted of 4 posts set in concrete with horizontal supports attached between 3 of them. The whole thing was sturdy, well built, and completely unwanted. That evening I called my neighbor Mike, who lived 2 houses down. He was a decent guy, a volunteer firefighter who kept to himself mostly. I had helped him move some furniture when he first moved in, and we had a friendly relationship. Hey Mike, quick question. Did you know the HOA was planning to build firewood racks in the Woodland behind my place? Oh yeah, Brenda mentioned it at a meeting a few months back. I thought it was weird because I always figured that was your property, but she said it was common area. Why? Because it is my property, and they built on it anyway without permission. There's now a court order telling them to stay off. Seriously. Man, that's messed up. Brenda's been getting worse lately. She fined my wife $50 because our trash can was visible from the street on a non-trash day. It was because we forgot to bring it in after collection. $50 for that. Has anyone ever tried to vote her out? A guy named Paul tried last year. Suddenly, he got hit with violations for his fence being the wrong color and his grass being half an inch too tall. He ended up selling and moving. Most people are scared of her now. After talking with Mike, I spent the evening reading more about HOA law in Vermont. What I learned was interesting. HOAs had significant power, but that power came from the covenants and conditions recorded with the property deeds. They couldn't just make up rules or claim property that wasn't theirs. If they acted outside their authority, they could be held liable for damages. And in cases of particularly bad faith, board members could even be held personally liable. The next morning, I received a letter via email and certified mail from Brenda. Despite the court order, she was demanding I pay the accumulated fines, which had now reached $5,000. The letter stated that my refusal to cooperate with the community improvement project was detrimental to property values and community harmony. I forwarded it to Thomas, who responded within minutes. Do not respond. Do not pay. Save everything. This is more evidence of harassment. That weekend, I decided it was time to remove the structure. I documented everything first with photos and video, including measurements and close-ups of how the posts were set. Then I got to work. The horizontal supports came off easily with a drill and some effort. They were made of good quality lumber, untreated pine that would burn well in my wood stove. I stacked them on my back deck. The posts were harder. They were 4x4s set in concrete about 2 feet deep. I dug around each one, breaking up the concrete with a sledgehammer and pry bar. It took most of Saturday and half of Sunday, but I got all 4 out. The posts themselves were also good quality lumber. Looking at the pile of wood, an idea formed. These materials had been brought onto my property without permission, used to build something I didn't want, and were now mine to dispose of. And I had a wood stove that heated my house. I spent Sunday afternoon cutting the lumber into lengths that would fit in my stove. The 4x4 posts I cut into 10-inch pieces with my chainsaw. The horizontal supports I cut into smaller sections. By evening, I had a neat stack of firewood on my back deck, all from the dismantled structure. That night, I loaded my wood stove with pieces of the former HOA firewood rack. The pine burned hot and fast, warming my living room nicely. There was something deeply satisfying about it, watching the wood that had caused so much trouble literally going up in smoke for my benefit. Over the next week, I continued burning the wood from the rack. The 3 cut birch trees I processed as well, cutting them into rounds and splitting them for firewood. Birch is excellent firewood, and it seemed appropriate that since the HOA had destroyed them, I would at least get some use from them. Meanwhile, the HOA wasn't sitting idle. I received another notice, this time claiming that by removing the structure, I had destroyed HOA property and was liable for the cost of materials and labor. They were claiming $6,000 in damages and demanding payment within 15 days. Thomas was almost gleeful when I forwarded him this letter. They're burying themselves. They built on your property without permission. A court told them to stop, and now they're claiming you destroyed their property by removing an illegal structure from your own land. This is going to be an easy case. When's the actual trial? We have a status conference in 3 weeks. I expect they'll try to settle before it gets to trial. No lawyer worth anything would advise them to actually go to court with this. The status conference was a brief meeting with the judge where both sides updated her on the case. Judge Henderson listened to both lawyers summarize the situation. So let me make sure I understand, she said. The HOA built a structure on Mr. Marks's property, despite clear evidence it was his private land. Mr. Marks obtained a restraining order. He then removed the illegal structure from his property. And now the HOA is claiming he owes them money for removing the illegal structure. Rodriguez actually looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, the HOA maintains that this was a misunderstanding about property boundaries. A misunderstanding. Mr. Rodriguez, property deeds and surveys are public record. There's no ambiguity here. What there is, however, is a pattern of harassment and bad faith by your client. Mr. Reeves, what are you seeking in damages? Thomas stood. Your Honor, we're seeking compensatory damages for trespass, triple damages for timber trespass under Vermont law for the destroyed trees, punitive damages for bad faith and harassment, legal fees, and a permanent injunction preventing the HOA from any further interference with my client's property rights. How much are we talking? We estimate between $50,000 and $75,000, Your Honor, depending on the final calculation of damages and legal fees. Rodriguez actually flinched. Your Honor, that's excessive for what amounts to a property line dispute. This stopped being a simple dispute when your client destroyed trees, continued building after being told to stop, and then tried to fine the property owner for defending his rights. Here's what's going to happen. You have 2 weeks to present any evidence, and I mean actual evidence that your client had any legitimate claim to this property. If you can't, I'm ruling for the plaintiff on liability and will move to a damages hearing. If you want to settle this before then, I suggest you do so. Dismissed. Walking out of the courthouse, Thomas was practically bouncing. That was even better than I hoped. Henderson's not playing games with them. 2 weeks to settle or face a trial they'll definitely lose. You think they'll settle? I think their lawyer is going to strongly recommend it. The question is whether Brenda Carmichael has enough sense to listen. 4 days later, Rodriguez called Thomas with a settlement offer. The HOA would pay $10,000 and agree not to build on my property. In exchange, I would drop the lawsuit and waive any future claims. Thomas called me to discuss it. It's a lowball offer, but it's something. What do you want to do? What do you think we'd get at trial? Honestly, I think we'd get at least $40,000, maybe more. The timber trespass alone could be $15,000 to $20,000 with triple damages. Add in your legal fees, which are going to be substantial by the time this is done, and the punitive damages for their bad faith, and we have a strong case for a big award. Then let's reject it. I'm not interested in letting them off easy. They need to learn they can't do this to people. I was hoping you'd say that. I'll let Rodriguez know. The rejection of the settlement offer seemed to be a wake-up call for the HOA. 3 days later, Rodriguez called with a new offer, $45,000, a written apology, and a permanent agreement not to claim any part of my property. The offer was good for 48 hours. This time, Thomas thought it was reasonable. It's actually a bit more than I estimated we'd get at trial when you factor in the uncertainty and the time it would take. Trials are never guaranteed, and this way you get paid now rather than waiting months or even years if they appeal. I thought about it for a day. The money would cover my legal fees and compensate me for all the hassle and stress. More importantly, it would send a message to the HOA that they couldn't just push people around. Let's take it, I told Thomas, but I want that written apology to be specific. I want them to admit they trespassed, built without permission, destroyed my trees, and that the woodland is my private property. No vague corporate non-apology. Thomas negotiated the final terms. The settlement included a detailed written apology signed by Brenda Carmichael and the entire HOA board, $45,000 paid within 30 days, and a recorded document permanently acknowledging my ownership of the woodland and prohibiting any HOA claim to it. The day I received the settlement check, I also got the written apology in the mail. Reading it was deeply satisfying. Brenda's signature looked forced, the handwriting sharp and angry. The letter admitted every wrongful action, acknowledged my property rights, and apologized for the unfortunate misunderstanding and overreach. But the story didn't end there. About a month after the settlement, I attended an HOA meeting for the first time in over a year. I wanted to see what would happen now that Brenda had been forced to back down so publicly. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. About 20 residents were there, which was apparently a high turnout. Brenda sat at a table in front with the 2 other board members, a middle-aged man named Richard and an elderly woman named Susan. When the meeting started, Brenda tried to move through the agenda quickly, but a resident named Jennifer raised her hand during the open comment period. I want to talk about the settlement the HOA had to pay Xavier Marks, Jennifer said. $45,000 is a lot of money. That comes from our HOA fees. I think we deserve an explanation about how this happened and what we're doing to make sure it doesn't happen again. Brenda's face tightened. That matter has been resolved. It's not appropriate to discuss settled legal issues. Actually, I think it's very appropriate, Mike, my neighbor, spoke up. We all pay dues. We should know when the board wastes money on lawsuits we had no chance of winning." Other residents murmured in agreement. I sat quietly in the back, watching Brenda squirm. The board acted in good faith based on our understanding of property boundaries, Brenda said defensively. Did you look at the actual property deeds before sending contractors onto someone's land? Jennifer pressed. We relied on our community development plan. That's not what I asked. Did you verify the property ownership before authorizing construction? Brenda didn't answer. Richard, the other board member, looked uncomfortable. Susan stared at her hands. Another resident stood up. I want to make a motion for a special election to recall the entire board and elect new members. The room erupted in discussion. Brenda banged a gavel, looking panicked. That's not how this works. You need to follow proper procedures. Actually, Thomas said, standing up from a few rows ahead of me. I'm here as a resident, not as anyone's lawyer, but I did review the HOA bylaws before coming tonight. Any member can motion for a special election with a showing of cause and support from 25% of residents. If that motion is made and seconded, you need to hold a vote within 30 days. I hadn't known Thomas lived in Pinewood Heights. Looking around, I recognized several other faces from neighborhood forums and Facebook groups, people who had been complaining about the HOA for months or years. The motion was made, seconded, and supported by signatures from over 30 residents who had apparently come prepared. Brenda tried to argue and deflect, but the bylaws were clear. She had no choice but to schedule the special election. The election was held 4 weeks later. In that time, 3 residents stepped forward to run for board positions: Jennifer, Mike, and a retired teacher named Patricia. All 3 ran on platforms of transparency, accountability, and respecting property rights. Brenda and her 2 allies tried to run again, but the mood had shifted. Too many residents had stories about unreasonable fines, selective enforcement of rules, and harassment. The lawsuit settlement had been the final straw, showing clearly that the board had been acting outside its authority. When the votes were counted, all 3 challengers won by wide margins. Brenda's 7-year reign as HOA president was over. The new board's first action was to review all outstanding fines and violations. They dismissed dozens of them as either excessive or improperly issued. They also implemented new rules requiring board decisions to be made publicly and requiring approval from a lawyer before taking any enforcement action over $500. For me, life returned to normal. The woodland behind my house remained untouched and natural, exactly as I wanted it. The 4 holes where the posts had been filled in and reseeded, and by summer, you could barely tell anything had been built there. The 3 cut birch trees left stumps that eventually sprouted new growth. I still heated my house with my wood stove, though now I bought my firewood from a local supplier rather than dismantling HOA projects. The memory of burning that unauthorized structure remained one of small but significant satisfaction, a literal consumption of the problem that had invaded my property. One evening in early fall, about 6 months after everything had settled down, Mike knocked on my door holding 2 beers. "Thought you might want to celebrate," he said. "The new board just posted the financial report. We're actually under budget for the first time in 5 years. Turns out when you're not paying settlements and legal fees for stupid lawsuits, HOA fees can actually go down." We sat on my back deck, looking out at the woodland as the sun set through the trees. The leaves were starting to turn gold and red, and the air had that crisp quality that promised a cold winter ahead. "You know what's funny?" Mike said. Brenda was always going on about property values and community standards, but the best thing for property values was getting rid of her. I've heard from my realtor friend that houses in this neighborhood are easier to sell now that word's gotten out about the new board. What's Brenda doing now? I heard she moved out, sold her house and moved to some other town, probably to terrorize a whole new HOA. We laughed at that, though it was probably true. People like Brenda didn't change, they just found new places to exercise their need for control. The next morning, I walked out to my woodland with my coffee, enjoying the quiet. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, completely unmarred by unauthorized structures. Birds called from the branches, and somewhere deeper in the woods, I could hear a woodpecker working on a dead tree. This was what I had wanted when I bought this property. Peace, privacy, and the right to enjoy my own land without interference. It had taken a legal battle and months of stress to defend that right, but it had been worth it. Later that day, Jennifer called me. As the new HOA president, she was working on updating all the community documents to make them clearer and prevent future abuses. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "If you hadn't fought back against Brenda, the rest of us might never have found the courage to challenge her. You showed us that the HOA doesn't have unlimited power. I just defended my property rights. Anyone would have done the same. Actually, no, lots of people wouldn't have. Lots of people in this neighborhood paid unfair fines and accepted unreasonable rules because they thought they had no choice. You proved they did." After we hung up, I thought about that. It was true that many people backed down when confronted with authority, even illegitimate authority. The HOA had counted on that, had built their power on people being too tired, too busy, or too scared to fight back. The key had been documentation and the willingness to follow through. I had kept every email, every letter, every work order. I had taken photos and videos of everything. I had hired a good lawyer and listened to his advice. And crucially, I hadn't backed down when they tried to intimidate me with fines and threats. The settlement money, after legal fees, left me with about $28,000. I used some of it to repair and improve my property. I had a proper survey done with new markers at all the corners, making my property lines absolutely clear. I installed a nice split-rail fence along the back of my yard where it bordered the woodland, not to keep anyone out, but to make the boundary obvious. I also donated $5,000 to a local legal aid organization that helped people fight unfair HOA actions. If my experience could help others in similar situations, that seemed like money well spent. The old board members faced no criminal charges because what they had done, while wrong and costly, didn't rise to the level of criminal activity. It was civil trespass and harassment, not theft or fraud, but they did face social consequences. Brenda especially found that many people in the neighborhood no longer wanted anything to do with her, which likely contributed to her decision to move. Richard, one of the other old board members, actually apologized to me personally one day when I ran into him at the grocery store. "I should have pushed back against Brenda," he said. "I knew the woodland was probably your property, but I just went along with what she wanted because it was easier than arguing. I'm sorry." "You could have checked the property records," I said. "It would have taken 10 minutes. I know. I was lazy and I was a coward. She was so sure of herself that I just assumed she knew what she was doing. I learned my lesson." I accepted his apology, though I didn't forget what had happened. People in positions of power, even small power like an HOA board, had a responsibility to act carefully and fairly. When they didn't, people got hurt. As autumn progressed into winter, I burned my way through several cords of properly purchased firewood. My stove kept the house warm through the cold Vermont nights, and I never once regretted the time and money I had spent fighting the HOA. One snowy evening in December, I sat by my wood stove reading while the fire crackled. Outside, snow was falling steadily, covering the woodland in white. Everything was peaceful, exactly as it should be. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Thought you'd want to know. The state bar filed a complaint against Rodriguez for his handling of the HOA case. Apparently, he never advised them properly about property law or their chances of losing. He might face discipline." I smiled at that. Justice came in many forms. The HOA had paid for their overreach. Brenda had lost her position of power. And now the lawyer who had enabled it all might face consequences too. But more than any of that, I had my property back, undisturbed and protected. The legal documents from the settlement were recorded with the county, permanently establishing my ownership of every inch of my land, including the woodland. No future HOA board could ever make the same mistake, not without deliberately ignoring clear, recorded evidence. Over the next few months, the new board continued to make positive changes. They reduced the frequency of violations, focusing only on issues that actually affected the community rather than petty aesthetic complaints. They made the budget transparent, posting it online where everyone could see where their money was going. They even organized neighborhood events that people actually wanted to attend, like a summer barbecue and a holiday lights contest. The atmosphere in Pinewood Heights changed noticeably. People seemed more relaxed, more willing to actually talk to each other rather than worrying about being reported for some minor infraction. Property values did indeed increase, but not because of strict enforcement of arbitrary rules. They increased because the neighborhood became a place where people actually wanted to live. I found myself attending HOA meetings occasionally, not because I had to, but because they were actually productive and interesting. The new board sought input from residents and made decisions transparently. It was how an HOA should have operated from the beginning. One spring evening, almost a year after the whole saga had begun, I hosted a barbecue in my backyard. Mike came, along with Jennifer and several other neighbors. We stood on my deck, looking out at the woodland where new growth was filling in where the birch trees had been cut. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Mike said. "This time last year, Brenda was sending contractors onto your property and fining me $500 a day for objecting to it," I added. "Whatever happened to that fine notice?" Jennifer asked. "The one demanding $5,000 or whatever it was, sitting in a folder with all the other documents from the case. Evidence of harassment that helped me win the settlement." "Did you ever worry you might lose?" Patricia asked. She had been elected to the board and was now serving as treasurer, bringing much-needed organization to the HOA finances. "Not really. The law was too clear. The only question was how much time and money it would take to prove it. That's the real problem with HOA overreach. Even when you're right, fighting back costs money and stress. A lot of people can't afford either one, so they just give in." "That's why the new board is being so careful," Jennifer said. "We never want to put someone in a position where they have to choose between their rights and the cost of defending them." As the evening wore on and people drifted away, I found myself once again on my deck alone, watching the sunset through the trees. The woodland was alive with spring growth, birds building nests in the branches, and small animals moving through the underbrush. This was my land. I had the deed to prove it, the survey markers to show it, and now legal documents that made it absolutely clear to anyone who might question it. But more than that, I had the satisfaction of knowing I had stood up for myself when it mattered. The wood from that dismantled rack had long since been burned and turned to ash, swept out of my stove and scattered in my garden as fertilizer. In a way, it had come full circle. Wood taken from trees, built into something I didn't want, removed and burned, and returned to the earth to help new things grow. As I sat there in the fading light, I thought about all the people in HOAs across the country who faced similar situations. Not all of them involved trespassing and construction, but many involved overreach and harassment. Some people fought back, and some didn't. I hoped my story might encourage at least a few people to stand up for their rights when the time came. The HOA had assumed I would back down. They had assumed their authority was absolute and that a threatening letter would make me comply. They had been wrong on both counts, and that mistake had cost them dearly. But I didn't feel victorious in a triumphant way. I felt satisfied that justice had been done, that rights had been defended, and that a system that had been broken was now functioning better. That was enough. Winter came around again, and I prepared my wood stove for another season of use. This year's firewood was stacked neatly on my deck, properly seasoned hardwood that would burn clean and hot. No more pieces of unauthorized construction projects, just honest fuel for an honest purpose. The HOA sent out its annual report, showing that they had ended the year significantly under budget. Without legal fees and settlements to pay, the fees for the next year were actually decreasing. Several new families had moved into the neighborhood, attracted by the improved reputation. I ran into Brenda exactly once after she moved away. It was at a hardware store in a neighboring town. She saw me and quickly turned down another aisle, clearly not wanting to speak. I didn't pursue conversation. There was nothing left to say. Life continued normally after that. The woodland behind my house went through its seasons, green in summer, gold in fall, bare in winter, and budding in spring. I continued to enjoy my property exactly as I wanted, without interference or unwanted structures. The legal documents from the case sat in a file cabinet in my office, a reminder of what I had gone through, but no longer something I thought about daily. The fight had been necessary but temporary. The peace that came after was permanent. Looking back, I could trace a clear line of cause and effect. The HOA overreached. I pushed back. They doubled down. I escalated to legal action. They continued their harassment. The court saw through their actions and ruled in my favor. They were forced to settle. The residents saw what had happened and demanded change. New leadership was elected. The neighborhood improved. It was a simple story in many ways, but an important one. It was about property rights, about standing up to bullies, and about the fact that just because someone claims authority doesn't mean they actually have it. The firewood racks that Brenda had wanted to build never materialized anywhere in the neighborhood. The new board decided that if residents wanted communal firewood storage, they could build it on actual common property near the community center, not on someone's private land. A few residents took them up on that offer, and a small but appropriate rack was built in a location where it belonged. My woodland remained mine, undisturbed and natural, a small preserve of peace and privacy in an increasingly crowded world. The trees grew, the seasons changed, and life went on. The entire experience had been stressful and expensive, but in the end it had been worth it. Because some things are worth fighting for. Property rights are worth fighting for. The principle that no one can just take what isn't theirs is worth fighting for. And the idea that even small authorities need to be checked when they overreach is definitely worth fighting for. I never became some kind of anti-HOA crusader. I didn't start a blog or write articles about HOA reform. I simply lived my life on my property, enjoying the rights I had defended. That was enough. But whenever I loaded wood into my stove and felt the warmth spreading through my house, I remembered those first pieces I had burned, the lumber from the unauthorized rack. I remembered the satisfaction of taking something that had been forced upon me and converting it into something useful on my own terms. That was the real lesson. When someone tries to force something on you that isn't theirs to give, you have the right to reject it, to remove it, and to use it as you see fit. The law protects property owners for good reason. Without that protection, we would live in a world where might makes right and anyone with a title could claim authority over anyone else. The HOA had learned that lesson the hard way, to the tune of $45,000 plus their own legal fees. Other HOAs in the area apparently heard about the case, because Thomas told me he had been contacted by several other attorneys asking about the details. Word spread in legal circles about what happens when an HOA tries to claim private property without basis. Years might pass before I thought about this episode again with any regularity. It would become one of those stories I might tell at dinner parties or when someone complained about their own HOA. But the impact would last forever, recorded in legal documents and in the improved governance of the neighborhood. As I sat in my living room on a cold evening, the fire crackling in my stove, I felt content. The fight had been hard, but the peace that followed was sweet. My property was mine, my rights were intact, and the woodland outside my window stood undisturbed. That was all I had ever wanted. And in the end, despite all the obstacles thrown in my way, it was exactly what I had achieved. The HOA had tried to take what wasn't theirs. I had stopped them, dismantled their attempt, and literally burned it in my stove. Justice had been served, warmth had been provided, and life continued on, better than before. And that, ultimately, was the best ending I could have hoped for.